So good morning, or whatever time of day it is for you, and welcome to Philosophy Live. I'm Graham Blackbourn from the Scottish branch of the School of Philosophy and Economic Science in Edinburgh. Thank you for joining me. This is the last Philosophy Live before we take a break for the summer, so I thought it would be good to end with a story. In fact, several stories, about a crow and a swan. This is one of these very old stories, a fable or folk tale that has appeared in different guises, at different places and in different times. The chances are that you've already heard some version of it. The oldest version I know of comes from the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, probably first written down several centuries BC, and almost certainly based on an earlier oral tradition. In the Mahabharata, it forms a story within a story. King Shalya, who's been tricked into fighting on the side of the unjust Kauravas at the Battle of Kurukshetra, is acting as charioteer to Karna, who is commanding the Kaurava forces. Shalya is trying to persuade Karna to move over to the side of justice and fight for the Pandava clan. Shalya tells Karna the story of the crow who, owing to his great arrogance, believes he can surpass the swan in flying across the ocean through exercising his numerous patterns of flight, while the swan knows only one manner of flying. As the crow inevitably eventually tires and begins to fall into the sea, the swan mocks him, asking whether the way in which he is beating his wings and beak against the water is another of his acclaimed flight patterns. The crow, abashed, appeals to the swan to save him, admitting his foolishness, and the swan takes the crow back to land, and the crow, as Shalya tells Karna, finally casts off his pride and boastfulness and adopts a life of peace and quiet. Sadly, Karna, as related in the Mahabharata, did not relent and was finally killed while fighting in the battle for an unjust cause. Actually, this version of the story contains several other twists and turns, rather characteristic of the immensely long Mahabharata, which we don't have time to hear now. You can read them for yourself in Book 8, the Book of Karna. But the crow and the swan reappear in Aesop's fables. Aesop may or may not actually have existed, though by tradition he was a Phrygian slave, and his name was given to a set of moral tales, mainly featuring a variety of animals, first compiled in ancient Greece, and dating from about the 6th century BC. Our tale does not appear in the earliest surviving collection of Aesop, but through time the collection grew, and it's known that a few centuries later, perhaps in the 1st or 2nd century AD, a number of stories were added, which appear to have originated in India. How this happened isn't known, but there were well-established trade routes between India and the Roman Empire, including trade in works of art, so it needn't come as a surprise. Aesop's fables, unlike those of the Mahabharata, are all very short and with a pithy moral attached. Here's Aesop's version of the crow, a raven in some versions, and the swan. A crow was filled with envy on seeing the beautiful white plumage of a swan, and thought it was due to the water in which the swan constantly bathed and swam. So he left the neighbourhood of the altars, where he got his living by picking up bits of the meat offered in sacrifice, and went and lived among the pools and streams. But though he bathed and washed his feathers every day, he didn't make them any whiter, and at last he died of hunger into the bargain. And Aesop's moral: you may change your habits, but not your nature. So a rather less happy ending than King Shalya's version. But again, a central theme is about acting in accordance with one's true nature. The detail that the crow used to eat the remains of bits of meat left on sacrificial altars may seem irrelevant to the story, although, interestingly, it compares with the full version of the story in the Mahabharata, in which the crow used to eat the leftovers of the sumptuous food offered to the children of a wealthy trader, perhaps showing a vestige of Aesop's Indian source. But my favourite version of the tale is that told by Sri Shantananda Saraswati, who for so many years conversed with the founder of the School of Philosophy and Economic Science, Leon McLaren. Let's hear his version now. Shantananda Saraswati said, "There's a story about a flock of crows. One of them was strong, clever, and good-looking, so they made him their leader. This king of the crows felt proud of his exploits and looked down upon all other creatures. One day a young swan appeared. The crows assembled around the swan and asked him if he knew about the great deeds of their king. He pleaded ignorance and wished to see their king. The king crow appeared and asked the swan about different types of flight. The swan, in his simplicity, said that he knew only one style. The king crow then embarked on an exhibition of his 101 styles of flight. Having performed his acrobatics, he asked to see the art of the swan. The young swan took off in a graceful, gentle, and natural flight, and as usual increased his speed only gradually. Since the crow was small and swift, he flew fast, and realizing that the swan was left behind, he came back to cheer him up. The swan gradually increased his speed, and it was not very long before the crow was tired and trembled, and eventually fell into the sea. The swan came down and rescued the crow and helped him back to his flock. The crow then became ashamed of his pride and thanked the swan for his modesty and magnanimity. You see, the swan lived a natural life, while the crow occupied himself in acrobatics and cleverness. The ultimate victory, said Shantananda Saraswati, goes to the natural, steady, still, and simple man, while the clever and smart waste their energy in trifling pursuits that only lead to their destruction. So the moral here is to cultivate our inner swan, to learn to live a natural, steady, still, and simple life, and not waste our energy in trifling pursuits. But, I hear you say, the moral attached to Aesop's fable of the crow and the swan was that we cannot change our nature, only our habits. So how am I supposed to become truly swan-like if I appear to be more like a crow? Well, the best response I can give to that objection has already been made in another, though less ancient, moral tale, The Ugly Duckling, by the 19th century Danish author Hans Christian Andersen. You probably know it. The young bird, separated from its parents before hatching, was so ragged and ugly that it was bullied and turned out from wherever it sought shelter, and hid itself away during the long winter night. Finally, seeing the beauty of a flock of swans, it decided to throw in its lot with them, even if they ended by killing him. But in doing so, the supposed ugly duckling discovered that it had been a swan all along. I can well remember, as a child, enjoying hearing on the wireless the American actor Danny Kaye singing the then popular song of the Ugly Duckling, ending with the words, "And he looked, and he saw, and he said, 'I am a swan. Say, who's an ugly duckling? Not I.'" So the moral of that story is that we do not need to change our nature, but just to discover our true nature, like that of the metaphorical swan, which is to say, as Shantananda Saraswati tells us, a natural, steady, still, and simple life, not wasting our energy in trifling pursuits. So we may like to try living in the way these favourite old stories suggest over the coming weeks. And here's how philosophy might help us today. And thank you. This is the last Philosophy Live before we take a summer break, but we'll be back again in September on each Friday morning of the term at the same time for a new series of philosophical gems. We'll look forward to you joining us then. Thanks again. Have a good summer, or winter for those of you in the south, and enjoy your weekend.